Our presentation continues in part 2 on our YouTube series. So web rendering is another big difference from print, which I've touched on, but I just want to reiterate this a little more clearly. Not all browsers render the page the same. And so because of that, we have to test all major browsers whenever we do anything with web rendering. So we do test regularly for Internet Explorer 7, 8, and 9. It's very important to test for those versions and see how a page looks on it. There are design elements and design choices that inexperienced designers can make, or even experienced ones occasionally, where something will not look the same on 7, 8, 9, where columns might flip apart, something like that. Firefox, Google Chrome, and Safari all tend to be a lot closer in how they lay out design. Safari is a little bit further off than Firefox and Chrome. Safari is not very popular as far as on Windows, though there is a version for it. But on Macintoshes, it is the default Apple browser, so it is important to test for that. And then, of course, we have our category of mobile, and that's iPhones, smartphones, tablets. It is important to the client that we look at that. Then we need to make sure that we're doing that, and we need to make sure that there's an expectation there when we do develop these pages about, hey, this might not look the same on an iPhone, or do you want it to look the same? What can we do there? So very important, click every link. When we test a page, and remember that a link is not just necessarily underlined text, it could be an image, and even so it could be not underlined or not changed. Usually when you hover something, you can see that cursor change to a hand or something like that. So it's important that we go through the page and we actually physically click on and open every single link when we're doing HTML development. The other thing that a lot of people miss, most people have their browser windows just maximized, and they open it up and say, this looks great, let's go with it. Well, it's important to realize that a lot of people might not have a screen as big as yours, especially if you're in a production department for print. You might have a really big, nice, gorgeous Macintosh display, Thunderbolt display like I have, and the thing's massive. But somebody else might be working on a 5-year-old Dell computer sitting in a back office, and they might have a quarter of the space on their screen that you do. So it's important to actually shrink and expand those windows. Email rendering, similar topic to web rendering, but a little bit more complex. So with the web rendering, we only have a handful of major browsers. And with email rendering, that's not the case. We have Outlook, and there are 3 versions of Outlook, 2003, 7, and 10 that are commonly in use, and they render things differently. And then we also have Gmail, which is very popular. A lot of people say Gmail, well, nobody's using Gmail for business. Well, it's not true. A lot of people have a branded domain and use Gmail. Even sections of the Department of Defense actually use Gmail, which I think is a little bit terrifying, but it's true. So Gmail is out there, and some people do use Yahoo and Hotmail, probably not so much in the B2B world, but they do certainly in the B2C, the business to consumer offers. So with all these different readers out there, they all behave differently. They render differently. So it's very, very important that we look at the email in those actual readers and see what it looks like. Can you click the links? Can you read everything? Does it look good? It's not going to look the same in all of these because they're so different, but the real key is it legible and professional and clean, and does it look good? So the next point that I want to make is that stuff that works on the web does not work in email. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but code from the web won't work in email, particularly the size of div or divider tags, which are the elements that we place around a page to make columns and widths and things like that. Floats don't work, and floating is where we want to stack things up across the page instead of going down, instead of going up and down vertically. So email needs to be simple. We want to keep it clean. It needs to be legible on mobile devices. Most people are reading it on a mobile device now. And we can't do a different design for a mobile device versus a print device versus a web page device like you can with the web. On the web, you can specify all of those. You can say for mobile viewing, I want this styling. For visual viewing, I want this. And for printing, I want this. You can't do any of that in email, so it needs to be simple and work wherever it's being rendered. The other part of that is there's no background images in email. You can certainly add in the HTML to do it, but particularly and most notably Outlook is not going to render any background images. They will be dropped. So you have to deal with that by having either on the page images or by actually using background colors that are solid colors. And you also have to be very careful about how you lay that out and what sizes are around tables and things like that. So last point here kind of to make under stuff that does not work in email is salesy copy. So salesy copy, free, win, play, exclamation points, anything that's a real pushy, heavy sales copy, things that are in capital letters, red being in the font size, that type of stuff is going to get read by a computer, and if it deems it to be junk mail, you're going to go in the junk folder. So that email will never be seen by the recipient. So it's really important not to have a lot of copy, because the more you have, the more salesy copy is going to get scored. And basically that spam score goes up and up and up, and as it goes up, it's more likely to get flagged into junk. So you want to keep the copy short and concise, and you want to make sure that you are careful about how you say stuff. You want to write your email copy so that it's desirable for the user. It's not a push thing with email. Nobody wants things pushed on them in email, and they will block you, and the spam filter will block you because it knows people don't want that. The flip side of that equation is it valuable information that your clients want to hear, information that's educational, that is a good opportunity for the client. That kind of thing is going to get read, and they're going to want it. And spam filters are fairly capable at figuring out what type of copy you've got in there in an algorithm. And if you have stuff that looks more valuable, it gets that algorithm, and you're more likely to get delivered. So it's important to invest in that copywriting effort. If you do have real salesy copy, keep it short. Put any little salesy copy in a small header image in a call out or a dot whack or something like that can't be read by the spam bot. And then keep the actual text that's on the page a little lighter. Now you do need to have about 50% area to 50% area maximum with images. So you can't put it all in an image so it can't be read. That'll get you flagged as well. But make sure that you actually put investment into that copywriting. And if you do need to have some heavier sales stuff, have a hook, get them to click through, use a landing page, use a generic URL or use a personalized URL, and get them to click through that website. And then on the website, you can say whatever you like. And then the last part, we've talked about some of these browsers that are out there. But the most important thing is that when you do an email, you've got to test it live. So we have a seed list where we have names, email addresses on all these programs at VDP Web. And when we develop email for our clients, we actually deploy live tests with the subject line fixed, with the copy fixed, and we make no changes to an email, no matter how subtle, without deploying another test. And in that test, we go through, and again, just like the web, we look at everything. We look at every reader that's available to us that is in our major market, and we click every single link. We make sure it's clickable. We make sure it goes to the right place. We review the from information. We review the phone numbers, all the common stuff that you do with proofing. Very important to do that in your final test, and very important to make sure that is a live final test and that you don't change anything in the email before it goes out. Unlike with print, once you click that send button, that email is gone. And whether that's to 10 people or 100,000 or 500,000 people, it's gone in a second out the door and beyond your reach. So you want to make sure you've got it right. So another big difference in print that I want to talk about, and this is true of the web as well as email, is it's images, gradients, and effects on artwork in particular. So images, we already discussed, have to be downloaded by clients in order to view the page. We got to keep them small. If they get too big, and what is too big, I don't feel like any images on a page really should ever be any bigger than 25 or 50 kilobytes on the high end. If you've got a really graphics intensive page and a really cool graphic and there's a good reason to include it, sure, you can go up to 100 kilobytes. People do that, but that's really pushing it. And then you've got to think about collectively, how many of those large images do you have? So we want to keep those small and keep it to a minimum. So the next point here is transparencies on photos should be avoided. Keep them square. I'll show a screenshot of what I mean about that later in the presentation when we talk about some specific examples. But the main thing here is that a photo has millions of colors, and there's really, in essence, only 3 types of images that we can use on the web, unlike with print where you have a lot of different choices for how you render and rasterize a print piece. On the web, we have a JPEG, which is what we use for anything that's got millions of colors. It's really the only choice. A JPEG is always square. It doesn't have rounded corners. It does not fade into transparencies. It cannot follow a contour line other than a square one. And square might be inappropriate. Rectangular is more appropriate. So it must be a rectangle of some sort. So even if you're trying to fade into a solid color and then you want to take that over with a background image or a background color that is not a JPEG, JPEGs don't make good solid colors. You're going to see pixelation and dots and stuff like that. And so fading a JPEG into something else to be transparent, it's very difficult to do. So the easiest thing is keep it square. The other types of images that we have other than that JPEG is a GIF and a PNG. They're both essentially the same. They are for a limited number of colors, commonly used for logos, commonly used for some type of fancy text. And the main idea is like 256 colors or less. Now with a PNG, which is the newest and most modern thing that's going on the web, essentially you do have the choice to actually do transparency, but just be aware that transparencies can be expensive. And when you get into a large transparency, and you're doing a lot of work with that, first off, it might not work on some of the older browsers or look so good. And secondly, it is going to use up a lot of space. So we want to make sure to keep those images fairly straightforward. So consistent gradients and effects only is the next point here. So when we say consistent gradients and effects, what do we mean? Don't do a fade that's hand-drawn or swirls that are hand-drawn where the designers come in and they put some pattern in there, or they've used Photoshop to do these multiple fades or patterns where they're coming from all these different directions. If you've got a gradient and an effect, keep it consistent, keep it moving a single direction. So up, down, diagonal at 45 degrees essentially are what you want to work with if you're dealing with a gradient. When you're talking about drop shadows, we like to use what's called CSS3. If you remember from earlier, CSS is a cascading style sheet, and that's what gives the look and fit and feel to a web page. The colors, the font sizes, the widths, all that is typically defined in CSS. And so in CSS, that's where we like to define gradients and drop shadows rather than making them part of the image. And the reason why that's so important is because remember, you've got the page running there and it could shrink or expand. And if I make that gradient or if I make that drop shadow from an actual hard-coded image, that image is going to have a specific size. And a specific size of an image is stuck with a specific size page. And the web is very much moving away from that. And so we want to make sure that we can actually do this mathematically using CSS and say, a 3-pixel fading drop shadow, or maybe a gradient that comes up from left to right, or from top to bottom, and starts with a darker green and runs to a light green, or what have you. So those are the available options. We want to use CSS. We want it to be mathematical. We want it to be consistent. The other thing to talk about is corners, and we'll see another example of this: rounded corners instead of squiggly or curved borders. So sometimes you'll see that a designer will do a kind of a crazy or fading border or something like that. Bad idea on the web. Especially if there's other images and other backgrounds involved behind it, because remember, we don't know where that's going to marry up on the page. It could be lower, it could be higher, depending on the browser, depending on if the form moves it around, because there's some feedback information. All these things have to be considered, so keep it very simple with the borders. Corners are good because we can do them in CSS3 finally, not a big deal, but stay away from the squiggly and the curved. Our presentation continues in part 3 of our YouTube series.